No one expected a bark to become the loudest sound in a mountain swallowed by snow. The storm had erased roads, hidden fences beneath towering drifts, and turned the Wyoming wilderness into an endless world of white where even seasoned rescuers refused to venture. Wind screamed across the frozen ridges at nearly 60 miles per hour, carrying needles of ice sharp enough to sting exposed skin in seconds. Visibility had fallen to less than 20 feet. Search helicopters had already been grounded. Emergency radios crackled with the same grim conclusion repeated over and over again. The missing family would have to wait until morning, if morning ever came. Ethan Walker tightened the collar of his weathered field jacket as fresh snow gathered across his shoulders. At 38, the former U.S. Marine still carried himself with the quiet discipline of a man who had learned long ago that panic solved nothing. His broad frame moved steadily through knee-deep drifts while frost settled along the edges of his short brown hair. A faint scar crossed his jaw, barely visible beneath several days of winter stubble, and his calm hazel eyes searched the blinding landscape with patient determination instead of desperation. Beside him padded Atlas, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose thick sable coat had already disappeared beneath a layer of powdery snow. His amber eyes never stopped moving. His ears shifted with every whisper of the wind, separating distant sounds from the endless roar surrounding them. The dog suddenly froze. Every muscle along his powerful body stiffened. Then came one sharp bark that cut clean through the blizzard. Ethan stopped immediately. Atlas never barked without reason. They had spent years together learning to trust instincts that couldn't be explained by maps, equipment, or training manuals. The dog stared into the swirling white curtain ahead, unmoving, as though something invisible stood just beyond the storm. Ethan narrowed his eyes, but he saw nothing except dancing snowflakes illuminated by the beam of his flashlight. Behind him, the radio hissed to life. "Walker, this is command. Return to base immediately. Conditions are deteriorating. Repeat, return to base." Ethan lifted the radio slowly. His breath escaped in pale clouds before disappearing into the freezing darkness. "Negative," he answered quietly. Atlas found something. Several seconds passed before another voice replied, weary and almost apologetic. "There is nothing out there anymore." Ethan lowered the radio without responding. Atlas barked again, shorter this time, then stepped forward into the storm. The German shepherd didn't hesitate. He moved with absolute certainty, weaving between snow-covered pines whose branches bent under the crushing weight of fresh snowfall. Ethan followed without a word. The deeper they traveled, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to fade beneath the heavy blanket of snow. The scent of pine mixed with the clean bite of frozen air, while towering evergreens stood like silent guardians watching every careful step. Ethan's boots crunched through untouched powder as Atlas continued climbing a narrow ridge almost completely hidden beneath drifting snow. Then the dog stopped again. He lowered his nose close to the surface, inhaled deeply, and released a soft whine unlike anything Ethan had heard before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It sounded almost like hope. Atlas pawed gently at the snow before lifting his head toward the dark outline of the mountainside. His breathing remained calm, but every movement carried quiet urgency. Ethan knelt beside him, brushing away a few inches of fresh powder with his gloved hand. Beneath the surface lay nothing but frozen earth. No footprints. No backpack. No broken branch. Only silence. Most people would have turned back. Atlas did not. The German shepherd took 3 careful steps to the left, lowered his nose once more, and continued forward with complete confidence. Ethan rose without hesitation and followed. He had learned years ago that the dog never chased guesses. Every decision came from something the human senses could not yet understand. The snowfall thickened until the flashlight reflected nothing except countless white crystals swirling through the darkness. The beam reached only a few feet before disappearing into the storm. Towering lodgepole pines creaked beneath the weight of fresh snow, and every few moments another heavy blanket slid from the branches with a muffled thump that echoed through the valley. The mountain felt alive, breathing slowly beneath layers of ice. Ethan checked the compass clipped to his jacket, then glanced toward the small handheld navigation unit. The screen blinked twice before fading into darkness. The cold had drained the battery completely. He slipped it back into his pocket without frustration. Technology had limits. Trust did not. Atlas suddenly veered away from the narrow trail and climbed a steep slope covered with untouched snow. Ethan struggled behind him, each step sinking nearly to his thighs. His lungs burned from the freezing air, yet he never called the dog back. At the crest of the ridge, Atlas stopped beside a weathered pine whose trunk leaned sharply toward the valley below. The dog stood perfectly still, ears forward, nose lifted into the wind. Ethan joined him and looked out across the endless white landscape. There was nothing except rolling hills buried beneath the blizzard. Then something caught his eye. Far below, almost hidden beneath drifting snow, rested the faint outline of a vehicle. Only part of the roof remained visible. The rest had vanished beneath several feet of snow. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You found them," he whispered. Atlas looked at him for only a moment before racing downhill. Snow sprayed behind the powerful dog as he disappeared into the storm. Ethan followed as quickly as he could, carefully choosing each step across the slippery hillside. By the time he reached the vehicle, Atlas had already begun circling it, nose pressed against the frozen surface. The sport utility vehicle sat tilted at an angle where it had slid off the mountain road hours earlier. Snow covered the windshield completely. One side mirror protruded from the drift like the last visible piece of a forgotten world. Ethan brushed away enough ice to peer through the driver's side window. The seats were empty. No movement. No sign of the missing family. He opened the rear door with considerable effort after clearing away packed snow. Inside rested several thick blankets, a small cooler, children's coloring books, and a bright red stuffed bear lying across the back seat. Everything looked as though the family had left in a hurry. Atlas ignored the vehicle entirely now. Instead, he walked several yards farther into the woods and stopped beside a line of nearly invisible impressions pressed lightly into the snow before the storm buried them. Tiny footprints. A child had walked away from the vehicle, and someone had followed close behind. Atlas released a soft whine, lifted his head toward the dark forest ahead, and without waiting for a command, disappeared once again into the white wilderness. Atlas moved with quiet certainty through the dense forest, weaving between snow-covered evergreens as though an invisible thread pulled him forward. Ethan stayed close behind, his boots sinking deep into fresh powder with every exhausting step. The tiny footprints vanished beneath drifting snow almost as quickly as they appeared, but the German shepherd never slowed. He trusted his nose more than his eyes, and Ethan trusted the dog more than either of them trusted the mountain. The cold settled deeper with every passing minute. Frost gathered along Ethan's eyelashes, and each breath crystallized before fading into the swirling darkness. Somewhere overhead, pine branches groaned beneath the growing weight of ice before releasing heavy blankets of snow that landed with soft thuds around them. The forest felt impossibly still between each gust of wind, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. Atlas suddenly stopped beside a fallen spruce tree almost completely buried beneath the storm. His tail stiffened. His ears lifted. Then he lowered his nose to something barely visible beneath a thin layer of powder. Ethan knelt beside him and carefully brushed away the snow with both gloves. A small knitted mitten appeared, bright blue against the endless white. It was no larger than the palm of his hand. Still dry beneath the surface. Recently dropped. Ethan turned it over gently, noticing tiny stitched snowflakes along the cuff. Whoever had worn it had not been gone very long. He slipped the mitten carefully into his jacket pocket and looked toward Atlas. The dog had already moved on. They continued deeper into the forest where the terrain became steeper and more uneven. Snow-covered boulders rose from the ground like frozen islands, while narrow openings between the trees funneled the wind into sharp, whistling currents. Atlas slowed for the first time since leaving the abandoned vehicle. His pace became deliberate. Every few feet he paused, lifted his head, and tested the air before choosing another direction. Ethan noticed something unusual. The dog was no longer following the footprints. He was following a scent carried by the changing wind. That realization made Ethan scan the hillsides more carefully. Somewhere nearby, someone might still be alive. Minutes later Atlas climbed onto a rocky ledge overlooking a shallow ravine. He stared downward without making a sound. Ethan stepped beside him and looked into the hollow below. Half buried beneath several feet of drifting snow rested the remains of a small campfire. Only a few blackened logs and a circle of stones remained visible. Nearby stood the faint outline of a collapsed emergency shelter made from branches, blankets, and a silver survival tarp that fluttered weakly beneath the accumulating snow. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Someone had survived long enough to build shelter. They had made good decisions. They had not given up. He carefully climbed into the ravine and examined the area. There were signs of careful preparation. Broken pine limbs had been stacked to block the wind. Melted snow had frozen inside a metal camping cup. A nearly empty package of crackers rested beneath the tarp, protected from the weather. Yet no one remained. Ethan looked around slowly, trying to imagine where the family could have gone. Then Atlas released a low, urgent whine unlike any sound he had made that day. The German Shepherd stood facing the opposite side of the ravine where a narrow opening disappeared between towering granite walls coated with thick sheets of ice. A faint smell drifted through the freezing air. Not smoke this time. Fresh pine mixed with the unmistakable scent of burning firewood carried from somewhere beyond the rocks. Ethan's eyes widened. Fire meant warmth. Warmth meant shelter. And somewhere beyond that frozen passage, hope was still alive. The narrow passage swallowed both man and dog almost immediately. Towering granite walls rose on either side, shielding them from the strongest gusts while trapping an eerie silence that made every footstep sound louder than it should have. Thin sheets of ice clung to the stone like frozen glass, reflecting the pale glow of Ethan's flashlight in shimmering ribbons. The faint scent of burning firewood drifted through the corridor again, stronger now, mingling with the sharp fragrance of pine resin and damp earth hidden beneath the snow. Atlas moved carefully instead of rushing ahead. His pace had changed. His ears pivoted constantly, listening for sounds beyond the reach of human hearing. Every few yards he paused, studying the darkness before taking another step. Ethan recognized the behavior immediately. The dog was no longer searching. He was approaching. At the end of the rocky corridor the passage widened into a small clearing surrounded by ancient evergreens. There, almost invisible beneath heavy drifts, stood a weathered log cabin with only part of its roof and chimney rising above the snow. Smoke drifted weakly from the chimney before being torn away by the wind. Ethan's shoulders relaxed for the first time since entering the mountain. Someone had managed to keep a fire alive. That alone could mean the difference between life and death. Atlas did not run toward the cabin. Instead, he circled it slowly, nose close to the snow, studying every corner with patient precision. Ethan followed the dog's movements and noticed something unusual. The front door had almost disappeared beneath packed snow, but fresh marks showed someone had cleared a narrow opening only hours earlier. Then he saw another detail. Beside the entrance rested a small sled, partially buried, with a bright yellow scarf tied around its handle. It matched the cheerful colors of the mitten tucked safely inside his jacket. They were close. Very close. Ethan climbed the final few steps through the snow and knocked firmly against the thick wooden door. His voice remained calm and steady. "This is Ethan Walker. Search and rescue. If anyone is inside, you are safe now." Nothing answered except the soft crackling of the fire beyond the wall. He waited several seconds before knocking again. Still silence. Atlas suddenly turned away from the cabin altogether. The German Shepherd walked toward a snowbank beside the rear wall and stopped. He pawed gently at the surface once, then twice, before lowering his head and releasing a soft whine. Ethan frowned. It made no sense. If the fire was burning inside, why was Atlas interested in the snow outside? He stepped closer and began brushing away loose powder with both gloved hands. Beneath several inches of snow appeared the edge of a wooden cellar door built into the hillside beside the cabin. One side stood slightly open, blocked by accumulated ice. Warm air escaped through the narrow gap, carrying the unmistakable scent of fresh firewood and hot soup. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Someone had chosen the lower shelter instead of the main cabin. It was warmer, safer, and protected from the relentless wind. He called out again, this time toward the opening. "Can anybody hear me?" For one long moment nothing happened. Then, from somewhere beneath the cabin, came the faintest sound imaginable. A little girl's voice, barely louder than a whisper. "Daddy. I think someone found us." Ethan closed his eyes for a single grateful second before opening them again. Atlas looked back at him, his amber eyes calm and unwavering, as though he had known all along exactly where hope had been waiting beneath the snow. The little voice echoed through the narrow opening like the first ray of sunlight after a night that refused to end. Ethan dropped to one knee beside the cellar door and pressed his gloved hand against the frozen wood. "My name is Ethan," he called gently. "I am here with my rescue dog, Atlas. You are not alone anymore." For a few seconds there was only the soft crackle of fire from below. Then another voice answered, this one deeper, exhausted, but steady. "The door is frozen shut from the outside. We have been trying to push it open all afternoon." Ethan examined the thick layer of packed snow and solid ice wedged against the heavy wooden hatch. The storm had buried nearly half the entrance. He took the compact folding shovel from his backpack and began clearing away the frozen buildup one careful scoop at a time. Atlas stayed close beside him, watching the surrounding forest instead of the door. Every few moments the German Shepherd lifted his head toward the trees, listening to the mountain as if he knew that danger in winter often arrived without warning. Snow continued drifting down through the towering pines while the weak smoke curling from the chimney disappeared into the gray sky. The warm scent escaping from below became stronger with every inch Ethan uncovered. It smelled of pine logs, canned soup, and fresh coffee that had long since grown cold. Ordinary scents. Comforting scents. Proof that someone inside had fought hard to keep hope alive. Nearly 15 minutes passed before the hatch finally shifted. Ethan gripped the iron handle with both hands and pulled with steady pressure. The frozen seal gave way with a deep groan. Warm air rolled upward, carrying welcome heat into the bitter afternoon. Looking down through the opening, Ethan saw a small cellar lit by the gentle glow of a wood stove. A father wrapped in a thick blanket stood protectively beside his wife while a little girl sat on an old rocking chair clutching a bright red stuffed rabbit. The blue mitten missing from her tiny hand immediately caught Ethan's attention. She looked no older than 6. Her cheeks were flushed from the warmth inside, and her wide eyes reflected equal parts fear and disbelief. "Atlas found your trail," Ethan said with a reassuring smile. The little girl looked past him toward the German Shepherd standing quietly in the falling snow. Without hesitation she smiled for the first time in days. Atlas answered with a slow wag of his tail but remained outside the entrance, calm and patient, as though he understood that the moment belonged to the family. Ethan climbed down the short ladder into the shelter and quickly checked on each of them. They were tired, cold, and hungry, but alert and able to speak clearly. The father explained that their vehicle had slid from the mountain road the previous evening. After realizing they could not free it before the storm intensified, they had followed an old hiking map that marked an abandoned ranger cabin nearby. They had reached the cellar just before darkness covered the mountain. The wood stove still worked, and enough canned food remained to keep them going, but they had no way to call for help after their phones lost power. Ethan nodded quietly while listening to every detail. Then he reached for the emergency radio clipped beneath his jacket. He pressed the transmit button. Static filled the speaker. He adjusted the antenna and tried again. More silence. The towering cliffs surrounding the cabin blocked the signal completely. Atlas suddenly turned toward the distant ridge, ears standing tall once again. The wind had changed, and somewhere beyond the trees, the mountain was preparing to test them one more time. Atlas stood at the cellar entrance without moving, his ears fixed toward the upper ridge where the wind had begun to change its rhythm. Ethan recognized the warning immediately. During his years in the Marine Corps he had learned that mountains often spoke before they acted. The air had grown strangely still, and that silence carried its own kind of danger. He climbed back through the cellar hatch and scanned the snowy hillside surrounding the cabin. Fine powder drifted from the pine branches even though the wind had nearly stopped. High above, hidden beyond the clouds, came a deep rolling sound that almost blended into the landscape. It was distant, but unmistakable. Snow was shifting somewhere on the mountainside. Ethan looked down into the cellar. "Everyone stays inside," he said calmly. "Do not come out unless I tell you." The father nodded immediately and pulled the hatch nearly closed to keep the warmth from escaping. Atlas remained beside Ethan, watching the ridge with complete focus. The German Shepherd suddenly trotted several yards away from the cabin before stopping beside a cluster of thick evergreen trees growing from a rocky slope. He barked once, then looked back toward Ethan. It was not a call for attention. It was an invitation to move. Ethan trusted him without question. He hurried through the deep snow until he reached the trees. The ground beneath them felt firmer because large granite outcroppings anchored the slope. The natural rock wall offered protection from anything sliding down the open hillside. Ethan turned back toward the cabin just as a broad wave of loose snow swept across the clearing. It was not a towering avalanche but a heavy snow slide triggered by hours of relentless accumulation. The white surge rolled silently over the roof, burying the cabin another few feet beneath fresh powder before continuing into the forest below. Snow filled the air until the world disappeared again. Ethan shielded his face with one arm while Atlas leaned against his leg, steady and fearless. Within moments the mountain grew quiet once more. The cabin chimney still poked above the drift, and a thin ribbon of smoke continued curling into the cold sky. Ethan released a slow breath of relief. The cellar beneath the cabin had protected the family exactly as he had hoped. He and Atlas worked together immediately, clearing the entrance before the fresh snow hardened into solid ice. Scoop after scoop, Ethan carved a narrow path while Atlas pushed loose powder aside with his powerful front paws, never wandering far from his partner. Nearly 20 minutes later the hatch opened again. Warm light spilled onto the snow as the little girl peeked outside with wide eyes. "Is it over?" she asked softly. Ethan smiled. "The mountain decided to remind us who is in charge, but we are all right." She looked toward Atlas, whose muzzle had become completely dusted with white. Without saying a word she reached into the pocket of her winter coat and carefully wrapped the bright yellow scarf from the sled around the German Shepherd's neck. Atlas blinked once, accepting the unexpected gift with quiet dignity. Even the exhausted parents found themselves smiling for the first time since the storm had begun. The warmth of that small moment spread through the frozen clearing more deeply than the fire inside the cellar ever could. Then Ethan noticed something he had almost missed. Above the clouds, far beyond the western ridge, a narrow ribbon of pale blue sky had begun to appear. The storm was finally breaking, and with clear skies would come the one sound every stranded family prayed to hear across the mountains, the distant beating of helicopter blades. The first sound was so faint that Ethan wondered if he had imagined it. He stood motionless in the clearing, listening beyond the whisper of melting snow sliding from the pine branches. Atlas lifted his head at exactly the same moment. His ears turned toward the western horizon, and his tail gave one slow sweep across the snow. A heartbeat later the distant rhythm returned. Soft at first, almost blending with the wind, then growing stronger with every passing second. Helicopter blades. Ethan closed his eyes briefly and allowed himself the smallest smile. He reached for his radio one more time, extended the antenna as high as he could, and pressed the transmit button. Command, this is Walker. I have located the missing family. 3 survivors. We need aerial extraction at my position. Static filled the speaker for several long seconds before a clear voice finally answered. Walker, your signal is weak but readable. Stay where you are. Rescue aircraft is inbound. Estimated arrival, 12 minutes. Ethan thanked them quietly and clipped the radio back onto his jacket. He looked toward Atlas, who had already settled beside the little girl near the cellar entrance. She sat wrapped in a thick blanket, gently stroking the yellow scarf now resting around the German shepherd's neck. The dog remained perfectly still, his amber eyes never leaving the tree line, as though he intended to guard the family until the very last moment. The father stepped outside carrying steaming cups of coffee poured from an old metal kettle that had survived years inside the forgotten cabin. He offered one to Ethan with both hands. It is not much, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Ethan accepted it with a quiet nod. The warmth spread through his gloves before reaching his frozen fingers. The rich smell of coffee mixed with pine smoke and crisp mountain air, creating a simple comfort that no expensive meal could ever replace. For several peaceful minutes no one spoke. The storm had finally surrendered. Sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, casting long golden beams across the untouched snow until every crystal shimmered like scattered glass. The mountain that had seemed so unforgiving only hours earlier now looked almost gentle beneath the clear winter sky. The little girl looked up at Ethan. Did Atlas know we were here the whole time? Ethan smiled before glancing at his faithful partner. I think he believed you were worth looking for long before anyone else did. She leaned forward and wrapped both arms around the German shepherd's neck. Atlas accepted the embrace with quiet patience, resting his head lightly against her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but one that seemed to melt away the fear still lingering inside the family. Moments later the helicopter appeared beyond the western ridge, its dark silhouette growing larger against the bright blue sky. Fresh snow swirled into graceful circles as it hovered above the clearing, lowering a rescue crew into the open space beside the cabin. The rescuers moved efficiently, checking each family member before preparing them for the flight home. One of them approached Ethan and looked toward Atlas with genuine admiration. Dispatch kept saying a rescue dog found them, he said. Looks like they were right. Ethan rested one hand on Atlas's shoulder and smiled quietly. He found hope first. I just followed him. As the helicopter lifted gently into the brilliant winter sky carrying the family toward safety, the little girl pressed her hand against the window and waved until the aircraft disappeared beyond the shining mountains, while Atlas stood silently beneath the drifting snow, watching every mile of their journey home. By the following morning the mountains looked completely different. Fresh sunlight poured across the endless slopes, turning every blanket of snow into a field of sparkling silver. The same wilderness that had hidden fear now carried an almost peaceful silence, broken only by the distant calls of ravens and the gentle creak of pine trees warming beneath the rising sun. Ethan, Walker and Atlas made the long hike back toward the trailhead, leaving behind a single line of footprints that stretched across the untouched landscape. Neither of them hurried. There was no need anymore. The mission had ended, but something deeper lingered in the quiet between them. News of the rescue traveled quickly across the county. The local sheriff shared the story during a community briefing, and before long photographs of the abandoned vehicle, the snow-covered cabin, and the German shepherd wearing a bright yellow scarf appeared on television and across local newspapers. Reporters praised the determination of the rescue team, but every interview seemed to circle back to the same remarkable detail. A rescue dog had refused to give up after experienced crews believed the search was over. Ethan accepted every compliment with the same humble smile before gently redirecting the attention toward Atlas. He never described himself as a hero. He simply explained that sometimes the best decision a person could make was trusting someone whose heart could hear what human ears never would. A few days later, the sheriff's department organized a small gathering inside the town community center. Families, volunteers, firefighters, deputies, and search crews filled the room while children bundled in colorful winter coats laughed beside tables covered with hot chocolate and homemade cookies. Atlas rested quietly beside Ethan's chair, still wearing the yellow scarf the little girl had wrapped around his neck. It had become impossible to remove. Every time Ethan tried, Atlas gently nudged it back into place with his nose. The family arrived to warm applause. The little girl ran across the room before anyone could stop her. She dropped to her knees beside Atlas and hugged him with both arms. The German Shepherd leaned gently against her, his tail sweeping across the polished wooden floor with slow, happy rhythm. Her father shook Ethan's hand firmly before reaching into his coat pocket. "We found this in the cellar after everything settled down," he said. He handed Ethan a small brass compass, its worn surface scratched by years of use. Inside the lid someone had carefully engraved 4 simple words. "Always follow what matters." Ethan turned the compass over in his hand, studying the faded lettering while sunlight from the nearby windows reflected softly across the brass. He looked down at Atlas, who calmly rested his head against Ethan's boot without asking for praise or recognition. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and gratitude, yet the German Shepherd seemed interested only in staying close to the people he had protected. Later that afternoon, after the gathering had ended and the parking lot slowly emptied, Ethan clipped the old compass onto his backpack beside his marine dog tags. He glanced toward the snowy mountains standing quietly beyond the town. Atlas followed his gaze before sitting beside him in comfortable silence. Neither of them knew when the next call for help would come. Neither of them wondered whether they would answer it. Some promises were never spoken aloud. They were carried in steady footsteps, faithful hearts, and the quiet understanding between a man and the dog who had taught him that hope often left the smallest tracks for those willing to keep searching. 1 year later, winter returned to the mountains with the same quiet beauty but without the same fear. Fresh snow rested gently across the pines, the frozen streams shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, and the narrow road leading toward the old ranger cabin had finally been cleared and marked with new safety signs. Ethan Walker parked his pickup truck at the trailhead and stepped into the crisp mountain air. Atlas climbed out beside him, a little slower than before but carrying the same calm confidence in every stride. Around his neck rested the familiar yellow scarf, carefully washed yet still carrying the memory of the little hands that had tied it there. Ethan adjusted the worn brass compass on his backpack, smiled toward his faithful partner, and together they began walking the quiet trail once again. They had not come for another mission. They had come because some places deserved gratitude as much as they deserved respect. As they reached the small clearing, Ethan noticed fresh footprints leading toward the cabin. A moment later, laughter drifted softly through the trees. The family was already there. The little girl, now a year older and noticeably taller, spotted Atlas first. Her face lit up with unmistakable joy as she ran across the snow before slowing just enough to throw her arms gently around the German Shepherd's neck. Atlas greeted her with the same patient warmth he had shown on the day they first met, leaning his head lightly against her shoulder while his tail swept slow circles across the snow. Her parents smiled as they approached Ethan. In the father's hands rested a neatly wrapped package tied with simple red ribbon. "We wanted him to have this," he said quietly. The little girl carefully opened the package herself and revealed a hand-knitted wool blanket sized perfectly for Atlas. Sewn into one corner were the words, "Our first hero." Ethan watched as she spread the blanket across Atlas's back. The German Shepherd looked up at her with gentle amber eyes before settling comfortably onto the snow as if accepting the gift was simply another way of accepting friendship. The family unpacked a small picnic beside the cabin, sharing warm soup, fresh bread, hot chocolate, and stories that no longer carried fear but gratitude. The little girl laughed as she pointed toward the ridge where Atlas had first found their trail. She could finally remember the journey without trembling. Ethan listened more than he spoke. That had always been his way. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, golden light spilled across the valley, turning the snowy landscape into a sea of quiet brilliance. A flock of birds lifted from the pine trees and disappeared into the glowing sky. No one rushed to leave. No one wanted to disturb the peace that had settled over the mountain. Before saying goodbye, the little girl reached into her coat pocket and placed the blue mitten Ethan had found beneath the snow 1 year earlier into his hands. "I think you should keep it," she said softly. "Because if you had not picked it up, maybe you never would have found us." Ethan looked at the tiny mitten for a long moment before carefully tucking it beside the brass compass and his marine dog tags. 3 simple reminders that hope often arrived one small step at a time. As he and Atlas walked back toward the trailhead beneath the quiet glow of the setting sun, their footprints stretched together across the fresh snow until they slowly disappeared into the distance. The mountain remained silent behind them, keeping its memories beneath the winter sky, while one faithful dog and one grateful man carried home something even stronger than victory. They carried the quiet certainty that the smallest act of trust could become someone else's miracle.